Okay, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines and History. I think we're on episode 17 now. So if you didn't hear last week's episode where we did some TikTok discussion, kind of converted a YouTube live into last week's episode, check that out. Some interesting information on TikTok and DJI drones and what the concerns are with Chinese-owned governments and data collection and those kind of things. And then the episode before that on a little bit of what's going on in Niger, a little bit of the history of Niger, and the latest military coup that's happening there, and what that means for the region and the rest of the world. So interesting discussion on Western Africa there. Now this week we're going to go into a little bit of a different direction. We're going to stick with the headlines and history concept, but we're going to get a bit more personal. And so, we've been putting out these episodes for a while now. 4 months, I want to say we've been at this, and I haven't taken the opportunity to discuss some of my personal experiences really in depth. And so I thought, this would, I just thought that now was a good time. I've got 15, 16, we're now on episode 17, and might as well take one of my deployment experiences and break it down into a couple different parts and discuss what it was like and what I was able to do when I served in my first deployment, and then we'll discuss the geopolitics of the day. We'll discuss a little bit of what was happening locally, and when I mean locally, I mean at home here, and the support for the war, and there was obviously a lot of pushback against the Bush administration's decisions to go into Iraq. We'll set that up, and then what my personal experience was like serving over there during that time. So since this is the first episode where I'm really going to start to have a conversation about my service and where I got some of the experience that I have today, it's going to make the most sense, I think, to go back to the beginning. And when I say beginning, I mean what it is that drove me to join the New York Army National Guard and why then I ended up in Iraq in 2005. Really as a result, right? I mean, you got to join the military before you can serve, and you can end up overseas deployed. So I'm from upstate New York, and traditional middle class American upbringing. But at the end of high school, I wanted to attend college, and I had siblings who were also looking to do the same thing, and so I wanted a way to get into school without going into as much debt as everyone understands is typical for a middle class person looking to go to school. There's a lot of money spent. You spend a lot of years paying off that debt. So I was looking for a way to make that a little bit easier. And so, in New York at the time there was, and there still is, but at the time when I was graduating high school in 97, there was a college reimbursement program. Basically, the National Guard in New York was offering free state college tuition for soldiers who joined, not just soldiers, but airmen as well, because the Air Force has a National Guard service in New York. And if you joined the Guard and you served for a certain amount of years, I signed up for 6 years at the time, that they would pay for your state education. And then it would be free. Again, just the tuition part of it. We didn't you didn't pay for room and board, but nonetheless, paying for tuition was kind of a big deal. And so, and they would also take that money and they would put it on private school payments. If you decided you want to go to a private school, they would give you the equivalent of state tuition to pay for that percentage of private school. But nonetheless, I decided I wanted to go to the public school. And as a matter of fact, I ended up at SUNY Cortland for a semester, which is what I wanted to do. So anyways, so I decided to join, and I joined the Army in particular because I had family in the Army. I had an uncle who was active duty, meaning this was his, obviously his full-time job. He wasn't just doing guard stuff, but he was full-time as an Army MI officer. I had a cousin who was full-time as an Army military intelligence, counterintelligence, warrant officer, and I have some other family members. My grandfather served in the Army in World War II. He was in North Africa. So, I just had more of a connection and more of a lineage, if you will, to the Army. And I'm not a big heights guy. So I just made the assumption at 16, 17 years old that Air Force is probably not a good idea. And the Navy and the Marine Corps don't have National Guard units in New York. I could have joined the reserves, but the National Guard was the organization that was offering college in the way that it was with the state tuition. So Guard it was, and in Army we went. I did have a funny experience early when I was still in the decision process. I don't remember how he got in contact, but an active duty Marine Corps recruiter got a hold of me and asked if he could come to the house and kind of just sit down and present his offerings. And yeah, no problem. So, he came to the house one afternoon. I remember sitting at the kitchen table and going back and forth with the Marine recruiter as he laid down his pitch, if you will. And it was really good. I mean, I remember feeling like, man, if I don't join the Marine Corps and do what this guy does, then, or do what this guy is offering, then, I'm like a bad person. And the world needs people like me and all these things. So I'm like, oh my God. So, the way he was presenting it really got to me. And he was in the kitchen when my dad came home from work. And as soon as he walked into the kitchen, my old man was like, hey, you got to go. Like, there's no Marine Corps in this house. You got to go. So needless to say, I didn't end up joining the Marine Corps. So, now my dad was polite and all those things, but pretty stern in that he wanted me in the National Guard. He didn't want me active duty, and he certainly didn't want me in the Marine Corps. So, not that there's anything wrong with the Marine Corps, it just wasn't the vision I guess my parents had. And anyway, so Army National Guard it was. So I remember joining in 97 and really being interested in just 1 weekend a month, which is what the requirement was, 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks out of the summer. I joined to do military intelligence stuff specifically because of the connection to my family who was already in the MI world. And I also, at the time, and this ends up becoming an ironic part of the story later in the future, but I wanted to be in the law enforcement field when I was in high school. So I thought to myself, well, I definitely don't want to be an MP and sit there guarding gates and things like that. But, I do want to do like investigative like work. And the closest I could come, at least in my mind at the time, was military intelligence. And you do stuff like that. You do investigations on bad guys and terror organizations and other militaries, things like that. So I was like, well, that's about the closest it's going to come. And again, the family does it anyway. So let's go. We're off into the MI community. And anyway, so I join and start doing my 1 weekend a month. And this is in 97, 98. So if you remember the time, there wasn't a lot going on. This is still the Clinton administration. The Berlin Wall had already fallen, obviously, nearly a decade earlier, almost a decade earlier. And the 90s were a relatively quiet time internationally, right? Relatively. We had Kosovo and we had some other things with Somalia. But from a great power competition standpoint and really from a terror standpoint, we didn't have major threats. And that's at least the way that it was presented, right? We had just other stuff going on. It wasn't something, the news wasn't carrying, the threat of major global powers invading others like we do today. We're constantly bombarded with information about China potentially taking back Taiwan, and we're talking about TikTok and how China is using all of these capabilities to collect information on the United States. And then Russia went and invaded Ukraine, and NATO's a big problem. It's encroaching on Russia. And, so there's a lot going on, and that just wasn't the case in the 90s. So there was just a general belief that the world was calmer. Let's put it that way. And so, again, and I'm speaking relatively here, right? And I remember hearing from my recruiter when she first signed me up saying, listen, if you join this National Guard unit, you're going to go to this MI unit here in upstate New York, and it's small, and it's really only been around for a little while. As a matter of fact, the MI battalion, the 642 MI battalion is the name of the unit that I joined. It was the military intelligence battalion of the 42nd Infantry Division. That unit is no longer around, and it was young when I had joined. I don't remember exactly when that unit stood up, but it wasn't long. It wasn't but 10 years. And the recruiter had said, listen, that's a unit is young. It doesn't have a lot of folks in it. It's not fully operational. It doesn't have a lot of training. And so, don't worry about any of this combat stuff. And by the way, there isn't any real combat going on in the world. And if there's anything that's needed, then the active duty will take care of it. And you'll just do your 1 weekend a month. Perfect. Not a problem. So that's how the career began. And I focused on school a little bit. I only did one semester. I ended up in the restaurant business, which is a whole different discussion for a little while. But needless to say, just doing my guard stuff. And then, as you might imagine, 9/11 happens. And just like it was for everyone else in the United States and then many across the world changed on 9/11. And it was brought back to reality. The United States was brought back to reality, I guess, if you will, on a whole, that, there are nefarious actors out there that want to do harm to the United States. And they didn't have to be nation states in any sense. They didn't have to be the Russian, or the Soviet military, crossing the Fulda Gap and invading Poland and Germany, but they could be smaller entities that were interested in harming the U.S. in their own way. Now, particular in 9/11, we did have the World Trade Center bombing in 1993 with Ramzi Youssef, who had tried to use the truck bomb concept, blew up a couple of truck bombs underneath the towers in 93, and did kill a few people and cause some major damage in the parking garage areas, but it didn't bring the towers down. And unfortunately, at least for the general public, it wasn't seen as anything as massive, right? Anything as large of a threat as you would consider 9/11, obviously. It wasn't successful and really kind of considered a one-off. Now, that's not necessarily how the national security environment viewed the 1993 bombing. It was definitely a concern, and as we, as a public, came to find out later that Ramzi Youssef was tied into Al Qaeda, and there were connections all along the way. And we would learn in the future that Al Qaeda and some of its contemporaries were trying to knock down the towers for many years, and obviously weren't able to do it in 93 and only were able to get that job done in 2001. But needless to say, it didn't really change the zeitgeist, the belief in what was happening at the time. But interestingly, when 9/11 happened, I remember the day I was standing, as most of us do who were alive that day, if not all of us, standing in the dining area of a little pizza joint that I was working at. Because again, I went to school for a semester and then came back out, got involved in restaurant stuff because I had big, bright ideas and whatever. So anyways, at this time I was working at this pizza joint, and I remember watching the video in the morning, as we all did. And I was sitting there with the other owner and some friends, because the obviously it was 9:00 in the morning and we weren't open yet. Close to 9:00, and thinking to myself, like, man, I better study up on some history here. I don't recall this ever happening in the past. I don't remember exactly when this was. And then obviously it took me a few minutes. I processed it and said, oh man, this is actually happening right this minute. And don't need to go too deep into this. Everyone has their own experience, and you all know what it's like on that day. But we got called that day. I was in the guard, right? We're doing 1 weekend a month, but this is a national emergency. So, we don't have cell phones really in any real way back then. So I got a phone call at the restaurant from the unit that said, hey, grab all your stuff and come down to the unit. I don't know what we're doing, and nobody really has any idea, but all we know is the governor's activated everybody. It was Governor George Pataki in New York at the time. We're activating everybody, get your butt in your car and get down to the unit. Okay. So I go home and I grab all this stuff that I think I'm going to need. There was no packing list at the time. It was just, grab your crap and get down here. And when I say down, I lived north of where the armory was. And so I got down there and we kind of waiting for orders and hanging out in the drill shed floor with all the young soldiers. I was, 97. So I'm in my early 20s. And nobody really had any idea. We're all kind of waiting for guidance from headquarters, which at the time it still is, but was in Latham, and the Joint Force headquarters at the time, and waiting to see what the governor was going to say and if they got any word from the president, really, and if the president was going to federalize, meaning take all of the National Guard soldiers and put them on federal duty and send them to wherever they were going to go. Come to find out, that wasn't the case. I had spent basically the entire day since, I don't know, 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the armory until we were released at, I want to say 9 or 10 o'clock at night, maybe 11 o'clock at night, when some decisions were finally made. And what ended up happening was the unit itself wasn't activated, right? The president didn't call down and say, we're sending the 42nd Infantry Division anywhere. But New York State, the governor did decide that he was going to send, for obvious reasons, a bunch of soldiers down to New York City to help in whatever way they could. And so that organization started, and who was going to go and what capacity and how many MPs and all that stuff was being decided. And a whole bunch of soldiers ended up going down to New York City and were down there for weeks. Some were even down there for months. I didn't end up down there myself. I should have. They didn't need me in the sense, all of the slots, if you will, that were filled were already filled. And so we just didn't need to tell anybody. And so it was on a volunteer basis at that point. And I didn't go down. I was a little selfish in that sense at the time. But a good amount of my colleagues did go down and spent weeks down there helping and doing everything they can, just like everybody else who had an opportunity to go to New York and do what they did. So, but needless to say, that changed the world, as I had said in the beginning. And so the mindset of all of us soldiers who were serving at the time had thought, well, and when I say all of us, I mean at least the soldiers that I was serving with, was, oh man, this isn't really a joke anymore. And not that it was ever really a joke in the first place, but it's getting more serious. And maybe we should, we really have to take a look at the world differently and think to ourselves, prepare for the time that we may be involved. We may in some way have to put our helmets on, put our Kevlars on, don your Kevlar, if you will, and then head overseas in whatever capacity. I don't know, but something to consider. And so, what turned out in 98 and 99 to be like, this will never happen kind of attitude turned into maybe it's not likely, but potentially it could happen. And so then obviously the President Bush at the time, he had ordered soldiers and activated CENTCOM to go into Afghanistan for obvious reasons, right? The Taliban was harboring Al-Qaeda and decided not to let anybody in. And we'll go. I have plans to do an episode in the future as to what all those particulars are and how that all went down, kind of a history of 9/11 series, and we're going to do that. But just for our purposes today, obviously the president had decided that he was going to send people into Afghanistan, because that's where he believed that bin Laden was, and some of his cronies, and the Taliban was holding him, or at least protecting him in a way there. So, but it really, the decisions to deploy soldiers, deploy airmen, sailors, Marines into Afghanistan really didn't hit home until the conversation started to shift to Iraq. And there's a lot of conversations, and we'll talk about that in the history of 9/11 series we're going to do. But there's a lot of discussions as to why those conversations started, why we needed to start looking at Iraq, or at least that's what the administration believed when those conversations started. It looks as if now that they started even back in 2002, potentially with Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense at the time. But either way, again, we'll get into that another time. But the conversations did happen, and the president and headquarters Department of the Army, right, DOD, is starting to say, well, I think we might do this Iraq thing. And when that happened, the push or the idea that the National Guard was going to get more heavily involved really kicked up, because, the United States military is only so large. I mean, it is large, right? It's the most powerful force in the world, and it's the most well-equipped force in the world. We all know that. But still, at the end of the day, there's only a certain amount of soldiers. There are only so many people in uniform. It often fluctuates around 1 million in total that can serve, and can only serve so many times before you really wear them out, if you will. So, we're sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Afghanistan that have to be broken up into certain divisional areas, and they're going to occupy certain areas, and then they're going to rotate back home. They all have to rotate back home. You can't be there forever. Whether you're deployed, quote unquote, forever, like you were in World War II, but those soldiers still rotated off the front line back when there was a front line. You'd serve on the front line, and then they'd rotate you back into France, and then you would serve on the front line and rotate you back. So all soldiers got rearmed and refitted. The same concept existed in Afghanistan, except there was no front line. And so if you were in Afghanistan, then you were in the front line constantly. And so the only way to not be on the front line was to not be in Afghanistan. And so the rotations were occurring, and the active duty, the 10th Mountain Division and 1st Infantry Division and 4th Infantry Division, all of these large active duty, at least Army divisions, were getting tired. And not only were they getting tired, now we have a significant increase in requirement because we have to go to Iraq. And Iraq is going to potentially need hundreds of thousands of soldiers if you're going to conduct what would eventually be a counterinsurgency operation, which is what most thought was going to happen after the fall of Saddam. There was no worry that the United States wouldn't be able to take Saddam out of Baghdad, out of power. That was going to happen, and it did very quickly. But it was more so what was going to happen afterwards. And there were discussions happening at the time within the administration between politicians and senior military leaders between how many people that would require. I mean, Colin Powell, as a example, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, said you're going to need at least 500,000 just for Iraq alone, which was the idea and concept he had in Desert Storm, that if you're going to take and invade Iraq to kick Iraq out of Kuwait, and then if you're going to stay in Iraq in any capacity in any time, in order to conduct a proper counterinsurgency, which is likely to arise, you've got to have 500,000 soldiers based on the size of Iraq and everything else. Well, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Donald Rumsfeld, at the time of 9/11 and in the Bush administration, had a concept of increasing the modularity of the Army in particular. And specifically what he was doing, get a little technical here, but traditionally in the Army, the main fighting force is at the division level. Okay, so that's the Army's main fighting force. And what I mean by that is the Army is structured around the division as the entity that leads the way. And the other echelons, a corps above them and the brigades and battalions below them, are structured in a way that allows the division to be the main heart of the fighting force. Okay, but divisions are large. They have 15,000-ish, 17,000-ish soldiers, depending on what kind of division you are, whether you're an infantry division or armor or whatever. But they're around that size. They have 4 brigades make up a division. And, the way that the structure is set up, the way that the support structure is that being the main fighting force, the division is the echelon size that can deploy by itself. Meaning you could say, all right, if I need a certain amount of troops, I can send a division somewhere, and that division can support itself. And it doesn't really need a lot of ancillary units for it to do its job, because all of the support equipment and the support staff is subordinate right there to the division. Well, post 9/11, given the change in the landscape, in the threat landscape, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld wanted to increase the modularity, wanted to increase the speed of the Army, and decided that he wanted to make the brigade the main fighting force of the U.S. Army. And so, meaning that a brigade can deploy on its own with all of the service staff and the support staff, and it can occupy, or it can enter, a battlefield without having to have any other brigades, or without needing a division headquarters per se to be there to give them support equipment, because the brigade already owned it, right? And so there was a transition that was happening in the 9/11-ish timeframe, early 2000s, where the divisions, where they had all of this equipment assigned to it, were being ordered to give their equipment, parcel it down to the brigades, so brigades could deploy on their own. So because this transition was happening, when the decision was made to go into Afghanistan and then eventually Iraq, Secretary Rumsfeld and his staff wanted to prove the concept of the modular brigade, and that you wouldn't need division headquarters to really own all of the equipment. These brigades can operate on their own, and they're bigger than they used to be. They're bulkier in the sense that they have more stuff. They have more artillery support. They have more logistics support. So they're bigger. But again, a brigade being, let's say, 3,500 to 5,000 soldiers each, that 3,500 to 5,000 might be larger than what a brigade used to be, but 3,500 to 5,000 is still much less than 15,000. So the Army, in a sense, would be lighter and would be faster, be quicker. And again, it would be a bit more modular. You can like plug and play these brigades in and out of other units, as opposed to the old concept, which was if you had, for example, the 1st Infantry Division, right? The 1st Infantry Division is made up of 4 brigades. They would be 4 infantry brigades that required their infantry division headquarters in order to operate properly. Well, he wanted to make each brigade so well supported that you could take, say, 2 infantry brigades from the 1st Infantry Division and 2 armor brigades, say, from the 1st Armor Division in Texas, and you could put those 4 things together and deploy them under an umbrella headquarters, and you wouldn't need to transition any equipment because each of the brigades had their own. So, okay, enough beating a dead horse on that concept. But anyways, the argument was that we have this new brigade modularity concept, and so we're not going to need as many soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. But still, regardless of whether that was happening or not, the military still only has a certain amount of people in it, and a certain amount of people you can put in the front line. So when Iraq came, the decision was, we've got to start sending some National Guard units into Iraq. We just don't have enough people. We're going to really wear down the Army. And so what happened was, by Operation, so if you recall, Operation Iraqi Freedom was the name of the overall operation, the Central Command operation into Iraq. It was Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. Operation Iraqi Freedom began in March of 2003 when the active duty went in with some very, very small but National Guard units. But the vast majority of the military, the Army that went in particular in 2003, was active duty Army folks. And those, the operation was broken down into yearly timeframes. So it was Operation Iraqi Freedom I, which began in March of 2003. And then you have Operation Iraqi Freedom II, which begins kind of in the springtime of 2004. And then you have getting ready for Operation Iraqi Freedom III, which would have began again in the spring of like 2005, right? And this is how the years go on. When it got to the planning of Operation Iraqi Freedom I and II, and Headquarters Department of the Army was looking at all of the National Guard, all of the Army units across the country, they were saying, listen, we're just not going to have enough, and we've got to be able to give these active duty units a break. So the Headquarters Department of the Army called down, if you will, down to the National Guard Bureau, which is this umbrella, it's not a command relationship, it's called a bureau, but it's basically like a liaison leader relationship between the Headquarters Department of the Army and the National Guard. And it helps to oversee all of the National Guard states that are out there. It's like a federal liaison organization. And so Headquarters DA calls down to National Guard and says, listen, we need a National Guard division to go to Iraq in 2005 for Operation Iraqi Freedom III. And so National Guard Bureau stepped into, overdrive and said, all right, well, we're going to have to contact the states. We're going to have to see which governors are okay with it. Because remember at the time, or remember legally, all of these National Guard divisions, whether they're part of the U.S. Army and they wear U.S. Army uniforms and they're federally funded by the U.S. Army, they're also partially federally funded by the governor, and they're under the command of the governor when they're not fighting wars overseas. And the way that the law is set up in the United States, it's not that the president just has full authority to just start grabbing all of these National Guard units. You have to have this relationship with the governor. And the governor has to agree that for whatever the mission that's coming up, that the governor is going to be okay with giving the National Guard division up to the president so the president can send the Guard division elsewhere. Now, you may argue to yourself, and you may be thinking to yourself, well, listen, let's be honest, when the president calls, and that's true. I mean, the vast majority of all of the training and the money that National Guard units get, they get from the active component. They get from big Army or big Air Force or whatever it is. And so, in theory, if the governor said, I don't want to give up my soldiers, they're in a state status and I don't want them going federal, then the president would turn around and say, well, then I'm going to take every single dollar of federal funding you have. I'm going to take all my tanks back and all my helicopters and all these great things that, you quote unquote state National Guard soldiers get to train on. I'm going to take all of that stuff back, and then you guys can just sit around and wear your New York State militia uniforms. That's clearly not going to work, right? So in reality, when the president calls, you go, right? And that's what happened. But interestingly, in the 2002 timeframe, when 2001, 2002, when these discussions are being had about going to Iraq, there are multiple National Guard divisions. I think now we have 9 National Guard divisions across the U.S. And soldiers are trained to fight. Soldiers want to fight in some capacity. Now, you'll definitely hear people say that if you've been to war, people that have been to war don't want to go back, and that is true. I mean, if you've seen combat, most people that have seen combat don't ever want to see it again. But at the same time, there is a service element to that, especially when you're dealing with a military that hasn't served in a long time in any real capacity. So you have all of these National Guard divisions that are, I don't want to, chomping at the bit, if you will, to say, listen, we can be the ones, we can do it. Big Army's calling. They want a National Guard division. We're the best National Guard division in the entire country. We can do it. Let us do it. And so multiple National Guard divisions made that argument, and they kind of sold it, if you will, to the National Guard Bureau and Big Army and said, hey, we're well equipped, we're well trained, we whatever it is, and choose us. We can be the ones. We want to serve our country, and we're supportive of this and whatever. So, and the decision was eventually made, and I don't know all the particulars and background dealings and politicians shaking hands, and who knows how all of that came down. You can use your own imagination, I guess. But eventually, the National Guard from New York was chosen. So the famed 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, it's headquartered in upstate New York, outside the Capital District of Albany. Specifically, it's located in Troy, which is just over the Hudson River. And, the Rainbow Division has a long history. It was stood up in World War I. It was deactivated for a while, stood back up in World War II, deactivated for a while, and then has been a National Guard division for years and years, but hasn't seen combat in its National Guard capacity as a division in forever. But again, it has a long history. The first chief of staff of the 42nd Infantry Division was Douglas MacArthur, and the famous general from World War II, served in the Pacific. And love him or hate him, he was an effective general. He eventually was fired, but he was good at what he did, and famous for the landings in Korea and the decisions that he made there to help push back the North Koreans and return the armistice line, if you will, to the 38th parallel. So whole nother discussion. But anyway, so he was the first chief of staff of the 42nd Infantry Division way back in 1917, I believe that it was. And he was the one that gave the division their name by saying that the 42nd ID, because they were drawing soldiers from across the entire country, spanned the United States like a rainbow. And so hence the rainbow as the name of the division. But anyway, so the 42nd ID was chosen, and they decided that, okay, it's the Rainbow Division that's going to go. They're going to go to OIF 3. They're going to go into combat, and they're going to be the first National Guard division to serve in a combat theater since Korea. And you're the ones. So we were chosen over the 40th in California and the 36th in Texas, other big National Guard states, and the rainbow it was. And so obviously when we get this information, we being the soldiers at our level, we had interestingly enough, we did have some early indications that, and this is in the 2002 timeframe, that the 42nd ID, late 2001, 2002, that the 42nd ID was possibly going to go to Kosovo, because the idea was, well, let's take the active duty units that are serving in these other locations that are not Afghanistan and Iraq and put them into Iraq and Afghanistan, and we'll give these ancillary missions, if you will, to the National Guard. So, okay, 42nd, you'll go to Kosovo while the active duty folks go over to Iraq or whatever. But again, the calculation was made and said, boy, that's not even going to be enough. Well, I think we're really going to be in a position where we have to put the National Guard into Iraq. And so that's what happened. And so here I am with my fellow National Guard friends and, potentially thinking about having to go to Kosovo and doing that UN-led mission over there to try to keep the peace, and did some training on the Kosovo mission. K4, S4 were the two missions that were, it's the name of the missions that were there. And then the call came down from National Guard Bureau and said, nope, change your plans. You're going to Iraq. And it was like, whoa, okay, well, this got for real. And we said to ourselves as soldiers, and obviously the leaders too, but said to ourselves, well, we are a National Guard division, but we're really only a National Guard division in a command structure. We don't have any what you would call maneuver brigades that live under or are part of the 42nd Infantry Division. We're just a headquarters unit. Yes, we're a divisional headquarters unit. We have a 2-star general that's in charge, and our, all of our staff officers are colonels, and we're designed and have all of the equipment that a division headquarters would have. We have a 642 military intelligence battalion. That's what I was a part of. And we had a division artillery command structure. We had all the things that would make a division headquarters operate, but we didn't have the brigades. There were literally no line brigades underneath the 42nd. So we said to ourselves, well, if you're going to send us, like, who's going to work for us? We don't have any other units that fall underneath. And Big Army said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take 2 National Guard brigades from other states. It was the 116th and the 278th. So from 2 other states, we're going to give you these 2 brigades. Remember, going back to the modular brigade concept, these 2 brigades can fall under a totally different division headquarters. And because there are 4 brigades in a division, we're going to give you 2 active duty brigades. We're going to give you the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division and the 3rd Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division. Now that was a shocker, because not only was it a shock that the 42nd was going to go downrange and a National Guard division was going to be in command, but then now my 2-star general, General Joseph Toludo at the time, was going to end up being the commander of 2 active duty brigades. So 2 active duty colonels who are brigade commanders of the 3rd Infantry Division are going to answer to my National Guard 2-star. You can imagine the type of political, back and forth that was happening within, the headquarters department in the Army, when the 3rd Infantry Division's like, what are you talking about? You're going to take 2 of my brigades and you're going to send them to Iraq and you're going to put them in the charge of a National Guard unit. So, but yeah, that was the answer. And so we prepared to do just that. The Army answered the call, or answered the question of who our brigades were going to be. And they said, we'll meet you there and get your training done. And you're going to head up to Iraq and that'll be that. And then your brigades will meet you there and you'll start the mission. And so that was the plan. And it was going to be for Operation Iraqi Freedom III, like I had mentioned earlier. So Operation Iraqi Freedom I, again, was March 2003. OIF 2 is March, April-ish 2004. And OIF 3 starts in the February, March, April-ish 2005. And so our training had to begin, obviously, before then. And we were told that we were going to replace the unit that was already there for OIF 2, this was the 1st Infantry Division. They were occupying the battle space we were going to in OIF 2. The 42nd was going to take charge and take command of OIF 3, that same location. And then when we were done, the 101st Airborne Division was going to come in and occupy the same location for OIF 4. So it was in our specific part of Iraq, which we'll get into more detail, but it was in the western part called the Sunni Triangle, that it was first the 4th Infantry Division, Iron Horse. Then it was the 4th Infantry Division, Task Force Iron Horse. Then it was the 1st Infantry Division in OIF 2's Task Force Danger. And then it was OIF 3's Task Force Liberty, which was our name. And then came in the 101st Air Assault afterwards, Task Force Screaming Eagles. So the time came, and we really had to transition and put ourselves into a next gear, if you will. The first gear shifted on 9/11 when we thought as a National Guard team, oh boy, this is getting potentially serious. And then the call came that we're going to Iraq, and it's like, well, it doesn't get any more serious than that. So I will say in the media atmosphere at the time, when it was, at least locally, when it was decided that the National Guard was going to jump into this divisional rotation downrange, there some of these conversations about what are we really doing here? I mean, if we've got to dig down into National Guard command structure in order to ensure that the active duty Army can maintain its operational capacity downrange, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, then, I mean, are we really making the right decision here? I mean, this was aside from whether Saddam needed to go, or this is aside from whether Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, or, those were legitimate conversations and they were happening as well. But the other angle to that was, geez, I mean, we're really calling people out of their civilian jobs. I mean, the National Guard is really to help with blizzards and those things. And I guess in the eventuality that Mexico invaded, maybe the National Guard would get involved. And yeah, I know we send some National Guard units like onesies and twosies kind of across the world, but nobody really pays much attention to that. Again, prior to 9/11, what are we doing here? Sending this massive National Guard division headquarters overseas? Are we really pushing our military to the brink? Are we really asking too much from these service members? And again, I'm specifically speaking about the Army, but it was the same for all the services. And is this something we need to be doing? And again, the conversation was, do we need to be doing it, or do we want to be doing it? Maybe he has weapons of mass destruction in some capacity. Maybe he's at least trying to build them. Maybe that's true. Yes, Saddam's a bad guy. I got it. But is now the time? I mean, we're trying to find and root out all of the Taliban, and we did that rather quickly in Afghanistan, but we're still trying to now, after 2001, 2002, we're trying to reestablish some semblance of a free-ish government in Kabul, and that's taking a lot of time, and there's an insurgency there, and Al-Qaeda is still operating. The Taliban is clearly still operating, even though they're not in charge. They're still operating against U.S. forces and NATO forces in Afghanistan. I mean, is Iraq, if you're calling the Guard, is now the time? And it was a legitimate discussion. It was something that we did think about. Now, I will say, from a soldier perspective, there were very few that were against going. And there definitely were soldiers who weren't necessarily fans of President Bush. Maybe that didn't vote for President Bush. Maybe they were Gore fans. And they maybe didn't understand or want to understand or even believe, I guess, what the arguments were for going to Iraq and removing Saddam. But the vast majority of soldiers did believe that it was a mission. It was a legal mission in the sense that Congress said yes, right? I mean, President Bush did go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, and he did, and he got it. And so, okay, I mean, we're gonna go. Congress said yes. And so they all wanted to do their duty. And yes, there were discussions at the time, again, about whether it was a politically a good idea or a geostrategically a good idea. if you recall back in that time, there was, in the Hollywood world, there was the battle between, at least in the music industry, is the battle between the Dixie Chicks, right, and Toby Keith. And Toby Keith was all about the American soldier and kicking Saddam's butt, and the Dixie Chicks were all about this is crazy, and so a lot of that was happening at the time, and some of it was, again, happening in the barracks when soldiers were yapping amongst each other about what we were doing. But again, the vast majority were gung-ho in serving their country. And they thought that if, they joined as a volunteer to serve the Army, right, to serve their country in the Army, and the Army said, you're going downrange, and so we're going downrange, right? And I think a lot of us, too, we were able to justify, even if there was some, we weren't necessarily as supportive, again, politically, don't really know if the arguments about weapons of mass destruction were legitimate. At the end of the day, Saddam's a bad guy, right? There's no argument about that, right? I remember one of my favorite, polemicists, Christopher Hitchens, saying, if you don't, in his world, being as much of a liberal as he is, he lost a lot of friends during the Iraq War because he ended up supporting the Iraq War. And one of his arguments was that, if you don't support the removal of Saddam from Baghdad, then you really have no idea how bad of a guy Saddam Hussein was. And that is true. I mean, the guy was a bad guy. I mean, the stories that would come out about what he allowed his family members to do, what he did himself. I mean, stories of his sons raping women on their wedding day on the altar. You go on and on and on and on about the crazy things that the Saddam regime did in Iraq. I mean, set aside the gassing of his own people in 1998 in Halabja, the Kurds who he couldn't stand. He was constantly trying to hurt them. I mean, he eviscerated them in many ways by attacking those towns up in the north where the Kurds live after the United States pulled out of Desert Storm in 91, which is a whole thing. I mean, he was a bad guy. Started the war against Iran as soon as he became vice president. He was vice president and then became president in 79. And then as soon as he became president in 1980, he turned around and attacked Iran, and which led to a massive bloody stalemate, killed many Iranian civilians in those 8 years. Then he invaded Kuwait in 1990. The United States had to go in with our allies and kick him back out of there. You can go on and on and on, right? Saddam was a bad guy. And so that, at the very least, was a partial justification, at least for those soldiers who were getting ready to serve. Were getting ready to say that, you know what, weapons of mass destruction aside, this dude's bad and he's got to go. And what a great place it would be, what a great opportunity we have here to potentially allow the Iraqi people to choose their own leaders and, restore a balance of power. And when I say that, I mean ethnically and religiously, right? Because the vast majority of people who live in Iraq are Sunni Arabs. The vast majority of people who live in Iraq are Shia Arab. The minority are Sunni Arab, but Saddam was a Sunni. And so he ran his little clique in charge in Baghdad by suppressing the Shia who live, again, who the vast majority of people who are in Iraq, and then gave them no freedom, didn't allow them to serve in the Ba'ath Party, all these things. And then he just completely hated the Kurds, and if he could have killed every single one of them, he would have. But, the Kurds make up 15-20% of the population that live way up in the north. And anyways, so getting rid of Saddam was a good idea, and at least in a vacuum, right? Like, Saddam shouldn't have been the leader of anybody. And it was actually, if you look back, it was actually the officially stated stance of the United States, as defined by Congress, and it began under President Clinton, that the official stance of the United States is that Saddam Hussein has to go someday. I don't know what day it's going to be, but because of all the things he lied about, because of all the weapons inspector stuff, gassing his own people, blah, 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 he's got to go. And so that, again, aside from the WMD conversation, was a partial justification. And me personally, that's what I felt. I looked at the world a little differently back then. I was a little younger. I think I'm a little bit more well-rounded, at least politically and historically, my understanding of how the world works, right? 45-ish now. I certainly wasn't then, 20-ish years ago. And And that was how I felt. I felt that, bad guys are bad, right? And good guys are good. And the United States, while not perfect, was quote unquote good. Our friends are good. Britain, France, Germany, Japan, right? All of our allies were good people, the Aussies, the Canadians. And they all say that Saddam's a bad guy. And he is. I think there's no argument to that. And so, WMD or not, the Army's called me to go to Iraq, so I'm going to Iraq. Okay, so that's the beginning of the story. That's when I joined, 97. Nothing's ever going to happen, right? I'm going to end up going to college. I only do that for a little while, end up in the restaurant business. The towers fall. We change our mindset a little bit. Then it's like, oh boy, 1st National Guard Division going to Iraq since Korea. We got to get our mind straight. And so we prepared, and we were told that we were going to, like I said, we're going to get a couple active duty brigades from the 3rd Infantry Division that fall under us, and we got to get ready for training. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take and wrap up this first part. We got us to where we are now, and then I'm going to do a part 2, and we'll start with what happened and where we went, right? We were tasked with going to Fort Drum to begin our training in it was May of 2004, and ended up being a really, really long training, much longer than we had ever thought. But, that was the time when it was, hey, let's get these National Guard folks squared away. let's get them into some barracks. Let's get their uniforms on, get their Kevlars, let's get their weapons, and let's get them into, an active duty post on Fort Drum in Watertown, New York, and let's start doing soldier stuff and get them trained up, and let's get them to Iraq. So, it was a really interesting experience, both from an intelligence standpoint and from a service standpoint downrange, and it all really kind of began when we hit Drum in May of 2004. So we'll get into that in part 2. So thanks for taking a listen here in part 1. As always, you can reach me, John Malik at headlinesandhistory.com. Check me out on social, YouTube. I'm John Malik at Headlines and History. You can check me out on Instagram. Continue to head out to my buddy's page, fellow veteran here in New York, spanglerforge.com, for all of your outdoor knife needs and blacksmith stuff. I mean, if you go hunting, really, you got to check out his website. He's got everything that you need. He does some really, really great work there. And as well as check out the link to Dark History in the show notes. Boy, he's got some great stories, and we're still working on a collaboration, which is definitely going to happen going forward with my buddy over across the pond in Dark History, and we're kind of ironing it out now, and we'll see what comes together. But it'll be good. I think it'll be really interesting, history focused stuff. Okay, again, thanks for joining me this week. Contact me, questions, comments if you need to, and we'll get ready for part 2 next week. Thanks again.